Welcome back, welcome back. Are you enjoying the soundtrack? Aren't you? From Star Wars to David Bowie. Thank you, thank you. It's been put together by the team. All right, I personally have been looking forward to this next session, which will be Caltech 5 on your Slido, because I think coming back to Caltech for some of us, it's joy, but it's also a bit of fear. Isn't it, Dave Zobel? A bit of fear. And I don't know if any Caltech grads still have dreams where in your dream you still haven't graduated. Right, it's finals week, or there's some problems that I think about at Caltech. I was a physics major that when I close my eyes and think about them, and I think this one was always this bead on a helix and write the Hamiltonian. I have no idea what I just said, I've blotted it out of my mind, but I think that you can think of moments at Caltech where we all had quite a bit of fear. However, this is good news, because for the elucidation and possibly the healing, our next speaker, Dr. Dean Mobbs, comes to us from the Fear Lab at Caltech. It should have its own music. Dean is professor of cognitive neuroscience, Alan B.C. Davis and Lenabelle Davis Leadership Chair, and director of the Caltech Brain Imaging Center. He's going to help us understand a little bit more about what happens when we respond to fear. So please enjoy Space, Time, and Fear, Survival Decisions Along Defensive Circuits. Welcome, Dr. Mobbs.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction there. I'm not sure I'm going to follow that. The title of my talk is Space, Time, and Fear, and I'm going to be not talking about that universe that surrounds us, but the universe that exists within our skulls. I'm going to first talk a little bit about how we go from our sensory phenotypes to this wonderful imagination system that we have, this inner eye that we have. And now this is important when we understand fear in humans. I'll talk then a little bit about the work that we've done on this sort of spatial temporal distance effects upon danger and how this determines our strategies. And then we talk about some of the work we've done on brain imaging. I'm then going to talk a little bit about safety perception. Now this determines our strategies. And then give some conclusions. And at the end, with a little bit of time, I'll just talk about a couple of slides about some of the more recent work that we've been doing on anxiety and social media. Okay, so as an effective neuroscientist, somebody who's influenced by the field of behavioral ecology and evolutionary biology, when I see a face like this, I see survival phenotypes. Okay, I see a set of ears, okay, that allow us to be able to detect the rustle of a potential predator in a bush, or the roar of a bear or lion in the distance. We have a system where we can smell threats as well. Although the smell olfactory system in humans is relatively poor compared to other species, we can still smell certain animals, particularly for those of you who have lived locally, you probably smelled skunks a few times. But finally, in terms of the face here, we think about ourselves as a visual species, okay? We have this ability to be able to detect threats at distances. We have the ability to be able to focus in on threats using our visual systems. And if we just focus a little bit in the beginning here on the evolution of the visual system, what we see is that in mollusks and other primitive species is that these species will sometimes have what we call a pigment spot. That's a set of visual cells here, light detecting cells that are flat. And what these cells can detect are shadows. If this pigment spot becomes a cup like this, all of a sudden those light-sensitive cells can detect lights coming from the left and coming from the right. So now the organism can make a decision to either flee from the left or flee to the right. As the eye becomes fluid-filled, we can use refraction to be able to focus that light onto these light-sensitive cells, okay, the retina cells as we call them, to be able to now to get more of a granular view of that stimulus in the environment. Now we can begin to detect the identity of that stimulus. Is it a predator or is it a prey? And finally, when we jump all the way up to our eyes, we have two eyes, we get binocular vision, we can have depth perception, we can focus our eyes, okay, to be able to separate threats from non-threats in the environment. And the moment that we evolved depth perception, we evolved the ability to see the future, okay? So here we can see a bear in the distance. And the moment that we see a bear like this in the distance, we can begin to plan to avoid that threat. okay? We can strategize avoidance. And what's very interesting is, in some respects, as the eye and our sensory systems evolved, so did the cognitive machinery, this machinery that's involved in strategic defensive responses, survival responses, also evolved as well. We also know that it's not just about how the eye evolved, but where it evolved on our heads, in some respects. If we look at grazing animals like horses, sheep, cows, we see that their eyes are on the side of their head. And this is advantageous for survival because now they have almost a 360-degree view of their world, and they can detect threats in the environment. Versus predators tend to have their eyes more centralized, which tells us a little bit something about what we are. But what fascinates me as a psychologist and a cognitive neuroscientist is this point in primate evolution, probably goes back to Homo erectus or before, over 1 million years now. But certainly something that we see in Homo sapiens over the last 300,000 years, is that we moved from using those sensory systems to detect things in the environment to this inner eye that we have to be able to simulate and predict threats in the future. I want to give you a couple of examples here, what's really fascinating about our imagination. One of my favorite philosophers, the Scottish philosopher David Hume, wrote about the Golden Mountain. And what he proposed was that we can all think about a mountain, okay? We can all think about gold, but in our mind, in our imagination, we can combine them to create a gold mountain. A gold mountain does not exist in the real world, okay? We can use our imagination to create new things about the world. We don't have to have an experience through the world. We can create them in our minds. Language plays a role in the way that we perceive the world. Wittgenstein proposed what we call Wittgenstein's triangle, where he said that if we see an image of a triangle like this, we call it a triangle. But if we take that triangle and we call it an arrow, it becomes an arrow. If we take that triangle and it becomes a pyramid, it becomes a pyramid. We have this very plastic ability in our minds to be able to perceive the same thing in different ways. But also this inner eye, this imagination that we have, is also important for what we call mental time travel. Those of you can sit there and you can think about in the moment that you're here in this lecture theatre, listening to this boring talk, and then you're in the present. But you might be thinking about the past, okay, your memories, what you did yesterday, but also you might use prospection to think about what you're going to do in the future. And this is important. If we can think about the future, we can think about dangers in the future, we can avoid them before we actually encounter them. One of the most adaptive strategies that any organism can have. But importantly, I think this gets us in trouble because if we can think about the future and we can think about the dangers of the future, we can become anxious about things that have not existed yet and maybe even anxious about things that may never happen. And I think that's why existentialists call us an anxious species in some respects. So what's this got to do with fear? Okay, well, I've alluded to this in some respects, but what this got to do with human fear is that when we're studying fear in humans, we need to understand really this rich internal environment that we have, this inner eye, okay? And now we use it to strategize and simulate experiences with threats, okay? And also, we wrote a couple of years ago about what we really need to question when we're asking about fear. And we need to really understand, first of all, in terms of fear and anxiety and our defensive responses, we need to understand what are the natural conditions that give rise to these emotions, okay? What are the temporal spatial properties of the environment? An animal that is evolved in open plains will need much better depth perception to be able to detect threats at distances. An animal that's evolved in forests where the leaves and the grass is in its face, it's not going to use its visual systems as much. It's going to use other senses more, okay? It's going to have different defensive responses. We also know that animals that are in environments where it's very difficult to predict predators will typically have things like shells and spikes, okay? Therefore, they don't necessarily always have to make a decision under those conditions. Their physical phenotypes is adapted for them. We also need to understand, as I mentioned, the traits of the threat as well. Is it an ambush threat, okay? Is it a fast attacking threat? And once we understand these natural conditions, we can begin to try and understand the strategies, the behavioral strategies that organism makes to avoid or escape from that threat? How does it overcome that evolutionary obstacle? And once we understand those behaviors, we can begin to apply computational models to understand what is an adaptive strategy and what is a non-adaptive strategy. We can also look then to see how other survival strategies are involved in these, or impact or mediate these different strategies. So for example, a mother protecting its offspring, an animal that is thirsty or hungry will try and suppress some of these fear responses, okay, and will change its strategies even in the face of predation. So once we understand these two components, we can begin to see what parts of the brain or the neuromechanisms that underlie these different strategies. And this is sort of the model that we've proposed that we need to really use, that when we're designing the experiments to study fear and anxiety in our brain. We don't like to use those terms, fear and anxiety. I'll come to that in a minute. So what is fear and anxiety? Well, we take very much a dimensional approach, okay? As usual, Charles Darwin was the first to mention this, where he said fear takes the gradation from mere attention to extreme terror and horror. But the way that we tend to define fear today is that emotion results from a presence of an highly imminent threat, a tangible threat. So if there was a tiger in this room now, and it was close to you, particularly if it was close to you, you would be feeling fear. But anxiety is associated with stimuli, threat stimuli that are abstract or distant in time or space. So abstract is about the future, something that's going to happen. Fear is about what's happening now. That's the way we define it, okay? So all of a sudden, you can see within these definitions that there's a spatial temporal component to the way we define fear and anxiety. So I'm going to show you guys a video now, an example of the sorts of questions that we ask. This is a gentleman being attacked by a tiger, okay? Nobody dies in this video, okay? You don't see the tiger actually bite him, but if there's any children in here, they might not want to see this. This is a tourist filming at a distance, okay, a tiger. This is what we call the post-encounter. There's a threat in the environment. Here, here's a threat in the environment. He knows the threat's there, but he doesn't know that he's under attack, okay? So this is where we get the anticipation. Is it going to attack or not? This is where the inner eye, in some respects, is trying to work out what the threat's going to do. And what you'll see now is that the tiger is attacking. This is what we call circus strike attack. And it jumps up, and it ends there, okay? And if you want to see more, you can go to attackfootage.com. Okay, so a question we have then in my lab is, what's happening in this gentleman's brain here when he knows there's a threat in the environment, okay? Doesn't know he's under attack yet, but is trying to work out, he's trying to strategize, he's trying to, in some respects, have a theory of mind of what that tiger is going to do. In the case of this first study I'm going to show you, what we're interested in is what's happening in this individual's brain here as the tiger is getting closer and closer and closer. It's still the same tiger, okay? It's still dangerous, but the way that you react to that tiger behaviorally and the brain systems associated with that are different, okay? And the vicarious sort of learning from this is that the stick is not a great weapon against a tiger. All right, I grew up in the 80s, as you can probably tell. I still gel my hair, that's from the 80s. I was very much influenced by some of the games back then, and we wanted to create a simple task where subjects were being pursued by a virtual predator in a virtual environment. So we're very much influenced by the game Pac-Man. Many of you might remember Pac-Man, you maybe still even play it. So we created a very simple task here. And what happens in this task is that the subject navigates this triangle around this maze, trying to escape from this virtual predator, okay? If that subject gets caught by the predator, they'll receive 1 or 3 electric shocks to the back of their hand, okay? I can hear some of you laugh there, but they're not that painful, okay? They're just like pinpricks on the back of the hand. We want them to be aversive, but we don't want them to be too painful because they get these repeated, okay? But what we're interested in here is what's happening in the brain as that predator gets closer and closer to them, okay? Much like that tiger example I just showed you. Now, there was a model that came out about a year before we started this study, back in 2007. And this model proposed that when threats are distant, you activate parts of the prefrontal cortex hippocampus, which is not on there, but also parts of the basolateral amygdala that we know are associated with strategizing, avoidance of threats. But as that threat comes closer, you shut down those prefrontal cortex systems, okay, because they're slow. You want to react. And the hypothalamus and the midbrain paraconductal gray, indicated there by PAG, are associated with that fight, flight, freezing response. If you go into the brain of a rodent and you stimulate these different columns of the PAG, you can stimulate one column for flight response, another column for freezing response, and so forth, okay? But the basic example is it's involved in reactive fear, in reacting to the environment, not thinking, okay? What do we see in this quite simple experiment here? Sorry, you guys can't see the line here. There's a line here, an arrow that points to the red dot there. But what it's basically showing is that when that dot is distant, there's increased activity here in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, much like that model I showed a minute ago, okay? And this is involved in more of that strategic response, maybe sometimes even that conscious feeling of threat. But as the threat comes close, you see a shutdown of that system in the prefrontal cortex, and just here you can see it looks like a pair of lips kissing the aqueduct just here, it's a blob, and you see this switch to these midbrain paraconductal gray areas. You don't want to be thinking if the tiger's here. If you're thinking when the tiger's here, you get eaten. You want to just react, okay? So this was the first experiment we did this. I did this as part of my PhD. We wanted to follow this up then with my postdoc, where we want to use more of a realistic stimulus. So you can guess from this what we did. We put people in the MRI scanner, and we moved a tarantula closer or further away from their foot, or we made them believe that at least. So here's the individual, here's a schematic, here's actually a real individual in the scanner. And what we did is we could decorrelate space and time here with this task. We would move the tarantula in each of these different open top bins closer or further away from their foot, okay? This is a Brazilian pink salmon bird-eating tarantula, okay? They're pretty big. You can see that's me picking it up there, okay? When I told the subjects about this task, I didn't mention the bird-eating bit. I thought it might scare them. So what we did then is that we put these in the scanner, we recorded their brain activity as the tarantula was closer and closer to their foot, okay? And what we found is that as we see the tarantula move closer and closer to their foot, there was parametrically increased activity in these regions of the midbrain, encompassing the paraconductal gray, that fight-flight-freezing system, that reactive system, okay? That increased again as the tarantula was placed close to their foot. Again, this was passive because they couldn't move. I mean, some nice laughs down there, thank you. What we found then was that when we moved the tarantula away from their foot, there was increased activity here in the ventral medial prefrontal region. Now, this was interesting because there was some indication from previous research that this region is associated with safety signals. When you're under threat, okay, and all of a sudden you see a police officer, for example, or you've got a weapon, or you feel safe, that region seems to come online, okay? It's indicating to you that you're safe. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. So, again, we've shown this switch between these midbrain systems and the medial prefrontal cortex. But we wanted now to create a task where we could look at decision-making to fast or slow attacking threats. So we went back to the ecology literature, and there's this sort of famous paradigm out there called flight initiation distance. What is flight initiation distance? It's the distance at which you flee from an approaching threat. It's a measure of threat sensitivity, okay? So in this example here, a simple example here, that when any animal is in nature and it's performing some survival functions, okay, it's got two things to consider. Okay, there's the cost of not fleeing. So if the predator's there in the environment and it flees too late, it's going to be caught by the predator. There's also the cost of fleeing. If the organism is performing some other survival behavior, mating, drinking, eating, for example, if it flees too early, it's giving up, okay, those other survival functions that it needs to have, okay? So there's always this balance between fleeing and not fleeing. So this is work by Sung Chi, who's now at NIMH doing the postdoc. And what we did is a simple task like this. Again, people in the MRI scanner, we have this platform here like this. And what happens is that there's this triangle here, and the subject can press a button any time for this triangle to go back to the safety of the exit. Now, the economic component to this task is that the longer they stay in that position, the more money they earn. Okay, so there's a motivation for them to stay there. They encounter a number of different predators. Here's two of them. What will happen is the predator will appear and begin to oscillate towards them, and at a certain point, it will attack them. Okay, the moment it attacks, they get caught. They can't escape. So they have to make these flight decisions before the threat attacks. So they have to learn the statistics of the environment. They have to learn that this blue dot is going to attack somewhere within this Gaussian, and this slow attacking threat is going to attack somewhere within this Gaussian. But they never fully understand or know exactly where it's going to attack. They just have some estimates. But that's on purpose because we want some individual variation in this as well. So our argument here then is that when you're making the decision to flee from this fast attacking threat, okay, this is going to activate more of those midbrain paraconductal gray fear circuits. Okay? When you've got longer time to think about that threat, that's going to activate more of what we call the cognitive fear circuits, but also these overlap with anxiety circuits in the brain, which will become obvious in a minute. So what do we find? Again, when they're making a faster decision to escape from that threat, midbrain paraconductal gray comes online, but also parts of the mid-cingulate region, which we know is highly connected to this region of the midbrain areas, okay? And again, as the midbrain regions are involved in flight decisions, there's argument that this input coming from the mid-cingulate region, we can see just here, may be associated with adaptive control of that behavior, okay? It controls when they're going to flee. And we ran some computational models to support that, which I'm not going to talk about now. But when they're making the decision to flee from the slower attacking threat, now they've got more time to think, okay? Different region comes online, still the same threat, still the same amount of shocks that they get if they get caught, but now they've got more time to think, okay? Medial prefrontal cortex, hippocampus comes online. This may be associated with more of that kind of strategic escape from that threat. Hippocampus, more information processing, particularly in the context of they're probably trying to remember where that threat attacked them before. They're trying to remember in a conscious way, okay? So our argument then was, well, if you need time to become anxious, it's a slow process, we should only see those anxiety circuits come online when they're making a slower decision, okay, and that should correlate with individual variation in what we call trait anxiety. It's a questionnaire that measures individual variation in trait anxiousness. And that's what we find. So what we find is that for the slow attacking threat, the more anxious they are, the later they will flee from that threat, okay? The earlier they will flee from that threat. We find that for the fast attacking threat, trait anxiety doesn't correlate with it at all, okay? So anxiety does not correlate with fear. When we look at the correlation between the neural activity in the brain and trait anxiety, individual variation in it, we don't see anything for the fast attacking threat. But for the slow attacking threat, we see the classic anxiety circuitry. The hippocampus and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, along with the insula, are increasingly active the more anxious you are. And the connectivity or coupling between these two regions is strengthened by the more anxious you are. And there's work by Josh Gordon and others has shown this in rodents as well, that this is more, that anxiety is associated with the connectivity between these regions. Okay, so the sort of last study I'm going to talk about here is safety perception. And this is a new study that we're not published yet, where we looked at what we call adaptive safety coding, okay? So many of you remember last year at the Oscars that there was this individual, Will Smith, and Will Smith was offended. I'm not going to promote his violence at all, but he was offended at what was said about his wife by this individual, Chris Rock. So what's going on when he's angry and decides to go onto the stage and slap Chris Rock, okay? What's going on is, first of all, he's looking at Chris Rock. He's upset, of course, but he's making also a judgment about safety and threat. If I go on stage and attack this individual, okay, he's smaller than me, okay, So I value him as not being as threatening, and if he does fight back, I'm bigger than him and I can handle it. Okay, so there's two things going on. There's the characteristics of the threat itself and the metacognitive ability to know if that person fights me, I can win the fight. Okay? But you could argue that if it had been The Rock rather than Chris Rock, he probably wouldn't have gone and slapped him around the face. Okay? That wouldn't have happened because all of a sudden he realizes that the threat value and the ability to handle that threat and combat it has changed. And I love this study that came out, or just this survey, yeah? You've probably seen it, yeah? If you ask Americans and British the likelihood of winning a fight against different animals, you see differences. So 2% of British people believe that they can win a fight with a grizzly bear. 6% of Americans believe they can. This doesn't change gorillas, lions, elephants. 2% of British, that's still pretty high, but 8% of Americans believe they can win a fight with an elephant. That's great. So we were inspired by that, of course. We always look for good ideas, and that's the foundation, I think, to good science. But we did a simple task here. What happens here is that you're given a threat stimulus like this, where it's an extreme threat stimulus like a bear or a lion, to a bird and a cat. And the question is, can we win a fight with each of these different stimuli? We had these all rated online and so on. But you're always paired up with a weapon as well. So it could be a fist, it could be a stick, or it could be a gun or a grenade. Okay? So what happens in this task is, I'll give you an example here, is you're given a picture of the lion here, and you're said, will you win or lose that fight with that lion? And then what happens is there's a short break here. This is in the scanner again. And what happens is that you're given the best weapon, okay? So all of a sudden, this is no longer really a threat, okay? Or it's less of a threat. I'll show you the probabilities in a minute. So you're more likely not to get a shock if these two are paired. But you can actually have it where it could be the lion and you have the fist, so you're more likely to get a shock, or it could be the grenade goes first, or the stick goes first, and we have all the different permutations of this. We scanned each subject for over 2 hours each to get a lot of trials here. So hopefully you guys can see that from there, but I'll explain it. So what happens, if you get the grenade, yeah, there's a 50% chance of winning a fight with a bear. If you get the grenade, there's nearly a 57% chance of winning the fight with the lion, 85% chance of winning the fight with a bird, and 93% chance of winning the fight with a cat, although I'm not sure what kind of people would use a grenade against a cat. Well, not surprisingly, what you see down here is the subjective win. This is their ratings of their likelihood of winning the fight. And you can see here that when they've got the fist, the worst weapon they can have, and the bear, they rate their likelihood of winning being much lower than if they're given the grenade and they're fighting the cat, okay? And you see that this was 100 subjects online where they lost money. And this is 30 subjects in the MRI scanner here at Caltech. And we replicate these effects. But what do we see in the brain? This is preliminary evidence. We're still going through this data. But what we looked at here was, what's the difference? If we look at the lion, I'm going to give you a simple example. We've got the lion, okay? This is the second stimuli. And we've got the lion here. But the difference between these two conditions here is that this one was preceded with a fist, a bad weapon. This one was preceded with a grenade, a good weapon, yeah, to beat that animal, okay? What do you see? If it's the lion is followed by a fist, okay, you're likely to receive an electric shock. Then what you see is that the insular, midbrain PAG regions, just here, you can see there's the aqueduct there, come online, okay? If it's a grenade, then you've got the lion, okay? Then you see this ventral medial prefrontal region I just talked about that's involved in these safety signals comes online. Now, we did a meta-analysis a couple of years ago where we looked at all the studies that looked at safety. And what we found is this clustering, that when subjects are given safety signals, this region in the anterior, that means anterior means the front part of the prefrontal cortex come online, but threat signals, okay, seem to come on more in the posterior, the back part of the prefrontal cortex here. And again, this is that region that we saw for the tarantula as it's moved away. In another study, we showed that when you're shown a dot that indicates that you're not going to receive an electric shock, this region comes online. When it's predictable, it's easy to predict a threat in the environment. This region comes on, this is less predictable in our margin of safety task. Here's another group from UCLA, Naomi Eisenberger's group, that when you're showing a loved one a picture of a loved one when you're about to receive a shock, this region comes online as well. So this is sort of a new region that we think that's important in trying to understand what might go wrong in individuals with anxiety disorders, because most of the research so far is focused on the amygdala, which I've not talked about today, but also this posterior region, but nobody's really studied that region. So conclusions. Fear and anxiety is a sort of dynamic process involving a complex set of defensive circuits. Distant, slow, gradual threat is associated with this cognitive fear circuitry, this anxiety circuitry, including the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, among other regions, hippocampus, and parts of the lateral amygdala. Proximal, close or fast attacking threats seem to push the activity in the defensive response to these midbrain regions involved in reactive fight, flight, freezing systems, motor circuits. And as I've just shown, the anterior part of the prefrontal cortex seems to be associated with these safety signals, suggesting that there may be a new region that we can target in individuals with anxiety disorders. What I've not shown is some of the work that we've shown that how the brain switches between these different systems. And a paper we have under review at the moment shows this seems to be in the hypothalamus. So we're supporting the work by David Anderson here and others showing that the switching between survival states seems to be in the hypothalamus. I want to finish up just the last couple of minutes here with some of the work that we've been doing on what we call the new ecology, the ecology of social media. And this is funded by Bill and Sonia Davido, who have supported this research in my lab. And we're just starting to get some data out of this now. Here's Bill's book. I recommend reading it if you're interested in the future of society and the relationship to machines. And what we know is that with social media, that since it began, there's been this gradual increase in depression in boys and girls. And this seems to correspond with the increased use and instigation of social media, okay? And we see a bit of a jump here, in particular in the time when we begin to see likes and retweets going on. And I have a daughter I, of course, adore very much, and she's going to want to go onto social media in the next 3 or 4 years, yeah? I don't want her to go on it at all, but she's going to be asking to go on it. And I want to figure out ways in which she doesn't go out into this wild west of social media, which is unconstrained, okay? And that we begin to get policies maybe, but also we begin to get training procedures in place to get these children prepared for going into this wild west of online social media. Again, let's go back to this model that I talked about earlier, that when we're trying to understand, okay, any phenomenon, particularly in the field I work in terms of fear and anxiety, we want to understand the natural conditions. And we've proposed in a paper that we're currently writing that if we break down social media, there's a number of different components to that environment that are different from the way that we communicate face-to-face. When we communicate online, things become disembodied, okay? There's no longer that physical barrier there, that physical boundary between me and you talking, okay? I'm using internal dialogue to communicate with you. I have impaired inference because I'm not seeing what your face looks like when I'm communicating with you, okay? So all of that disembodiment starts this process rolling. There's also a lack of accountability, okay? The avoidance of legal and moral norms, okay? Particularly if we're anonymous, okay, we can say whatever we want. It doesn't matter. We can say what we're thinking, okay? And this results in disinhibition, yeah? That if there's no consequences to behavior, okay, if I'm disembodied and not face-to-face with you, I can say whatever I want and you're not going to punch me in the face, yeah? So I've lowered self-control, more moral outrage or outrage in general to what you're saying. And if you have this environment can begin to start these toxic online environments. And if everyone feels like us, everyone's under the same situation, it begins to start this roller coaster, this snowball effect of these toxic environments. So we're working from this set of boundaries here to try and understand what is the environment, then build up from there about how this affects people's behavior. And some data that I literally got emailed me from my students yesterday was looking at these individual variation in trait anxiety. Remember we talked about this a few slides ago on the hippocampus prefrontal cortex are associated with this threat sensitivity. What we find is individuals who score high on trait anxiety, each dot here is an individual by the way, they show a preoccupation with social media. They check their social media more subconsciously. What that means is, you guys have all probably done this, you've got your social media and then you put your phone down. Next thing you know, your phone's in your hand and you're on social media again. You're not sure how you got there, yeah? But also, these individuals score high on trait anxiety and more stress when they don't have access to the internet. So this drive to be on social media, the more anxious you are, okay? But when you look at mood, those individuals who score higher on trait anxiety say that their mood is decreased, they have more negative mood when they've been on social media. So there's this drive to go on social media, but you feel worse about it when you've been on it, okay? It's interesting. We're going to replicate this on this is on over 100 subjects. We're going to run this on a larger sample. We're running these experiments in the MRI scan to see what happens in your brain when you feel anxious when you're interacting with others online. Okay, so I want to thank you all for staying around for this talk, and I want to thank all of my colleagues here over the years. Demis Hassabis is head of Google DeepMind, a long-term friend of mine, still a collaborator, helped with some of the early stuff on fear. And then my lab here at Caltech, particularly Song, I talked about Song and Bowen's work, Sarah's work on the safety, and Swati and Ket's work on the social media I just presented. My former lab at Columbia, who contributed to some of this work, my former PhD supervisor, Chris Frith and Ray Dolan, and all of my collaborators over the years. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. My goodness, the questions are buzzing, so I'm going to take them one at a time. I think Ryan has asked, we hear about sensory systems that create fear responses. What about fear that is self-generated, i.e. imagined threats, nightmares, PTSD? Do these involve the same or different brain circuits?
No, I think I see that as internally instigated in some respects, that we can imagine threats that we may encounter, but there may not even be a threat. We can exaggerate those threats in our mind. And it's understudied in terms of how our brain uses imagination, this inner eye in some respects, to create these fears that are not real fears in themselves, okay? And PTSD occurs, of course, due to some external threat, of course, but it only occurs in about 30% of people, 20 to 30% people who have experienced a traumatic event, experience PTSD. What is it about those 70, 80% of individuals who don't get PTSD? We don't know, why. Some people talk about it's the reconsolidation of the memory, that there's one study that if you give people like Tetris straight after a traumatic event and they're not consolidating that memory associated with the threat, that they show a decrease in their PTSD. But it's still ongoing. You need to keep the mind busy and distract it in those situations, in PTSD in particular.
Yeah, another question was sort of in that field, could this research have any relevance to training for law enforcement or the military, where extremely consequential decisions have to be made under duress?
It's interesting. I've got a friend who's doing work on this in the police force in the Netherlands, using a task where they use VR, and there's an individual who's either got a cell phone that goes like that, or a gun, and you have to shoot them in the VR system, and they're using this to train the police force to not make reactive decisions in terms of shooting people if they lift their hand up and it's a cell phone and they accidentally shoot them or something. And it's the reactive system that we have is quick and dirty. It doesn't think too much, but most of the time that when we're under threat, like an officer is under threat and thinks somebody's got them, they have to react, so they don't have time to think. This may come down to some form of recruiting. There's some nice work out there on Apache helicopter pilots in the military, and what you find is they score very, very low on neuroticism, which is a sort of indirect measure of anxiety, because you don't want to think. If you're having to make those quick decisions, you want to make quick decisions, but you don't want to have to think about them. Versus me, if I had to make those decisions, I'd be like, oh, do I do that or not? If you do that, you'll get shot, or the person who was going to kill someone is gone. You have to make quick decisions, so you can train people on that. But how plastic is that reactive system? We don't know. how can you train that reactive system? We can train your slower cognitive system. You know, that's what therapy does, yeah? But the reactive system, how do you train someone that's so innate and reactive, that's non-thinking? We think that it trickles down, but you have to go through a lot of training to do that. It becomes what we call model 3.
There's so many questions, right, in this space, so I'll just end with one. Why is it easier for some individuals, and this is to mentally overcome their perceptions of fear than others? Can you define what is going on in a hero's mind? It seems weird.
It's difficult. It's the way you appraise the situation. There's work on courage that shows that posterior part of the ventral medial prefrontal cortex I talked about comes online when you're controlling a snake coming closer or further from you in the scanner. That was a nice paper out of Israel. We couldn't have done that study here, by the way. We wouldn't get it for the ethics.
Tarantula, okay.
Tarantula, that was in England, yeah.
Where they really can win against a grizzly bear less times than we can, I guess.
We don't know the answer to that. It's a great question. Yeah, I can speculate, but there's not really much research out there on that.
There's a connection, a curiosity about, as a former participant of extreme sports, I'd like to ask, why is thrill-seeking so addicting? So I guess, is there a pleasure connection with some of it?
The near-miss effect is interesting in that context where, I think first of all, let me take a step back. Control plays a big difference. If you practice a lot and you feel that you're in control, then you downregulate those fear systems. Maybe that safety signal system, we don't know yet, becomes more active. And then at the same time, we know that particularly during a lot of these threats, that dopaminergic systems come online as well, which are rewarding, you know, these opioid systems. Avoiding a threat and learning, called a prediction area of threat, activates the dopaminergic reward areas. So I think there's definitely something a little bit strange about humans that we do that. But I think that there's definitely a biological basis to that seems to be in these opioid and dopaminergic systems in the brain. But, you know, I give this example. What's the difference between, I'm talking about in your brain, the sensory information that you get, the difference between when you're on a roller coaster that simulates a car crash and it's exciting. Your sensory system's getting the same information that, you know, there's this chaos going on, but you feel in control, you feel safe. Versus, you know, if I told you then that, the track at the end is missing and we can't stop it, that experience in that moment is exactly the same, but the perspective nature of the danger that's coming becomes panic and those systems no longer come online. So there is a cognitive function to this, and we see that even in things like the placebo effect. They're just perceiving something as a sugar pill, but perceiving that as a medication can downregulate your pain systems in your brain. So the power of the mind over these systems is really amazing. Yeah.
One other question in this category, coming soon to the Fear Lab at Caltech, the roller coaster, and then it's missing. It was recently reported that people tend to wildly overestimate their ability to land an airplane in an emergency. Is there any evolutionary advantage to being so arrogantly overconfident?
Have you ever heard of the Darwin Awards? These are the people who are super overconfident, the ones who said they could win a fight with a bear. We can learn from their mistakes. You know, there's a vicarious learning. If someone else has suffered a fate of making that mistake, we can learn through stories, and it teaches us not to do that. So that's the advantage. Probably not to them, but certainly to us.
So a question that I think everyone has been asked, has been liked, and everyone is thinking to end on perhaps, what attracted you to studying fear and anxiety reactions, Dr. Martins?
Well, I think it's an interesting story in science that you start doing one thing and then just ideas emerge and then this snowball effect. So I come up with this idea. I'd watch this, I talk about this if you get to my website, where I watch this horror movie. I'm a big zombie movie fan, I always have been since I was about 10. I shouldn't have been watching them movies then, but I was. And a classic thing they do in horror movies is, you've all seen this, where the monsters come in and the victim is trying to get the key in the door, and the monster's getting closer, and then the music, and Jaws is classic for this. Jaws is that ramping up a looming, that looming sounds, and it's getting closer and closer. We know looming activates the amygdala. If just looming sounds activate the amygdala. So I was like, this is interesting, because I had a friend who was studying the placebo effect, and I was like, yeah, but what happens like in these horror movies where the threat comes closer or further? Well, I'm not interested in the pain bit where it gets you. I'm interested when the threat's here versus here. Is anyone sitting there like, no, but there's some work, there's some theories out there. And I'm like, oh, so I came up with the idea of this sort of simple Pac-Man experiment, yeah, to test this first of all. And then all these other ideas just rolled off of that, and it just took me down that road where I am 15 years later, you know, 18 years later, gosh. COVID took away about 2 years, so. But yeah, so I think sometimes I say to people, you know, students who are undergraduates and so on, that sometimes, you know, there's paths that you're on, but you never quite know where it's going to take you, and sometimes you have to go with the flow and let it take you where it takes you, and it's been wonderful, yeah. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. What an amazing talk, Dr. Dean Mobbs. Please give a warm hand. And thank you, Paul Lee, for mentioning about you studying the level of fear of anxiety for Caltech students before a final. Thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Quite unforgettable, the cat and the grenade. Okay, we will take a quick break. Again, we'll see you back right at the next hour for our final presentation, Electrified Synthesis of Molecules.